Hey everybody, this is Ned, Negation of P. Had an invite to come together and talk about an argument that has been going around a little bit. Most, or all three of us have had hangouts concerning this argument, and we just figured we'd come tonight and kind of talk about what we dislike about it and maybe even like about it. The argument is the Leibniz cosmological argument. A lot of people feel this is a proof for God. So with that, I'm just going to let everybody else introduce themselves. I'm sure you guys know me. If not, I don't know what you're doing here. Anyway, um, the first guy is Lee, and Lee is the one who actually asked us to have this. So I want to, number one, thank you for asking me to do this, because we wouldn't be here tonight without you. And with that, go ahead and let us know what you're doing and your channel and everything else.
Hi, my name is Lee. I'm also known as the Mischievous Heathen. I'm getting actually a little echo from you, Ned. Okay. I have a YouTube channel, Mischievous Heathen. It's really easy to look up. For the most part, I've been a part of the community in comments. I watch a mega ton of videos, and I recently ran across this argument, and I reached out to Ned to get a little discussion going on it. He seemed like a good guy, and hopefully
my name is Lee. I'm also known as the Mischievous Heathen.
now I hear an echo of myself.
Yeah. Lee, what's happening there is if you've got the live YouTube feed going on at the same time, mute that one like you would mute on a normal video, and it won't feed back, because it's gonna have about a 3 to 5 second delay on these. Okay, and Matthew, go ahead and pick it up from there.
Well, I'm happy to meet Lee, and I am hoping to do more hangouts now. I've kind of been away from him for a while. I'm using a different computer than the one I normally use, and this one doesn't have a camera hooked up to it. But I've got a YouTube channel just called Matthew Steele. If you know me, then hello. How are you doing? I'm happy to be back and discussing with people, interacting with people, instead of sitting behind a camera in production and just spitting videos out. The personal aspect of this is every bit as important as the arguments themselves, to interact with people. So I'm looking forward to this argument, because frankly I'm tired of discussing morality and presuppositionalism and all of the same discussions that everyone keeps having over and over again. So this is something a little bit different. It puts a little bit of it, not a huge amount of difference in the spin of an argument for a creator, but it is different enough at least to explain why, what it is and why we disagree with it. Because as I've said many times, and I stand by, there are no theological arguments, points, or doctrines that I'm afraid to discuss or worried about, and none that I think are rationally justified. So this is just another one that we'd like to help people be aware of and educated about, as far as what the actual argument is and why we, at least from our perspectives, disagree with it. Ned, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before I start reading the actual argument itself?
No, again, anybody that wants to use this, my channel, copy it, paste it, cut it up. What I always hope to find in these discussions is more discussion in the comments. So please, if we screw this up, beat us up. I want to know where I'm wrong. With that, Matthew, go ahead and go into it so everybody knows what we're talking about. If you want to go ahead and read that, start that article that you've got.
Sure. It is officially called Leibniz's cosmological argument, different from the Kalam cosmological argument. And I'm going to read an excerpt here written by, I believe, Leibniz himself, who was a German philosopher. It says, beyond this world, or beyond the world, that is, beyond the collection of finite things, there is some one being who rules, not only as the soul is the ruler in me, or better, as the self is the ruler in my body, but also in a much higher sense. For the one being who rules the universe not only rules the world, but also fashions or creates it. He is above the world and, so to speak, extra mundane, and therefore he is the ultimate reason for things. For we cannot find in any of the individual things, or even in the entire collection and series of things, a sufficient reason for why they exist. Let us suppose that a book on the elements of geometry has always existed, one copy always made from another. It's obvious that although we can expect a present copy of the book from the previous book from which it was copied, this will never lead us to a complete explanation, no matter how many books back we go, since we can always wonder why there have always been such books, why these books were written, and why they were written the way they were. What is true of these books is also true of the different states of the world. For the state which follows is, in a sense, copied from the preceding state, though in accordance with certain laws of change. And so, however far back we go, or we might go, into previous states, we will never find in those states a complete explanation for why, indeed, there is any world at all, and why it is the way it is. Now, what he's talking about there are basically two things. One, the question, the age-old philosophical question of why is there something rather than nothing, and two, infinite regress of the material world. So his argument involves something called the principle of sufficient reason, that any contingent fact about the world must have an explanation. Now the argument itself goes like this. Let me scroll down here. The argument itself, come on. Here we go. Leibniz's cosmological argument. 1. Any contingent fact about the world must have an explanation. That's the literal principle of sufficient reason. Sorry about that. 2. It is a contingent fact that there are contingent things. 3. The fact that there are contingent things must have an explanation, which is a combination of points 1 and 2. 4. The fact that there are contingent things can't be explained by other or by any contingent things. 5. The fact that there are contingent things must be explained by something whose existence is not contingent, which is a combination of points 3 and 4. The conclusion of the argument, which I would argue is the obviously the most questionable in the whole form of the argument, is there is a necessary being. Now, that is the official argument of Leibniz, how he presented it at the time. Again, he is a German philosopher from, I believe, the let's see, I don't have the exact year here of when this argument came out, but let me go ahead and get you guys' feedback on that, what you think about it, and any issues that you have with it.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, back in the day, I think it could have been a fairly compelling argument, more than anything because it would have at least brought up the problem of infinite regress, and I don't think there was sufficient scientific evidence at that point to get out of that loop. And I mean, we can get into specifically how each of us dealt with it in our discussions, but I like the argument on that end because it was creative enough and interesting enough to where, without understanding how you can get out of that problem, it seems like it's going to hold up. It's going to be something that you would have to at least consider as possible. And to be honest, I think even at this late date, we can't definitively rule it out. I think it still has to be on the table as a possibility. But that right there negates it as a proof. It's not a proof, especially a mathematical proof, or in the terms of a mathematical proof in any way, shape, or form, let alone even just a conversational proof, in my opinion. But I don't want to go down that road too much other than just to say I see why it was developed, but I also think that because of where science is now, it's easily defeated and blown out of the water on multiple fronts. And I know, Matthew, you've you've got at least 5 or 6 that you want to go through. And I think, Lee, you wanted Matthew to kind of talk about it a little bit first before you came in, or are we right? Am I right on that, or did you want to go next? Because I want to make it. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say before Matt jumps in. When I first heard this argument, it seemed to me, at least, like a sort of like the Kalam in a way. I think it suffers from a lot of the same sort of objections I had for the Kalam. But I do agree that an extreme lack of knowledge about the universe in of itself, it plays to the strengths of this one. But like you said, nowadays I don't think it holds up. So, and we'll let Matthew go into his objections.
All right. And Lee, by the way, it is the YouTube feed that you need to mute, not the Google Plus feed.
Oh.
You don't have to mute this window unless you're doing something yourself.
Oh. Sorry, I'm a noob.
So I
You're one step below
it's
me.
all good. I mean, we all got to start somewhere.
It took me 30 minutes just to get this on air. You know how
blame it all on me, man.
It wasn't you. It was me tonight, and it's usually me. So
it's the whiskey.
And I got the beer. So, and Matthew, I'm sure, has got something. Us heathens always got to rely on the alcohol.
I have.
Anyway, Matthew, go ahead.
I have unsweet iced tea.
All right, you're driving, brother.
Okay. Yeah, I have 5 objections that I wrote out just shortly before this hangout, just because they were the ones that were most obvious to me about the argument itself. Okay, the first objection that I have is, I'm just going to read these as I wrote them and comment after. Objection 1, we have absolutely no way to establish the existence or attributes of anything outside of the observable universe. And likewise, no way to establish that these, what we know about the physical universe and can rely on for functioning inside the universe can lead to any reliable conclusions about anything that would exist outside or doesn't, or however. I mean, there's no, what I'm saying is there's no way for us to use what we know about this universe to form any reliable conclusions about what is outside our observable universe. Sort of like how what we see with our eyes is only a fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. You have ultraviolet, you have infrared, you have so many different degrees of what would be visible and is visible to other animals that is not visible to us, just because we don't have that capability. Well, it's even worse. It's magnified when we talk about what could exist outside of the observable universe, and when you factor in quantum mechanics. Anyway, I'll get to the next point. 2, we don't know the full scale of the observable universe. That's important because the physical reality is arranged so that it may only appear to follow what we now assume is true about the observable universe. And although we can use what we observe to reach tentative reasoned conclusions, we can't state definitively that the observable universe is bound by what we would therefore be assuming to be absolutely true. And that means that we are using what we have tested to be true, what we have learned about the observable universe to come to reasoned conclusions about how it works. But just as Einstein's general relativity theory ended up needing to be revised as more was learned about the observable universe, we can only go so far in what we can say about the actual state even of the observable universe, much less anything that could exist beyond it. 3, since we're part of the physical universe, we can't state to any degree of certainty that we are limited that the universe that we inhabit, the matter that we're made up of, is limited in any specific way as far as how we came to be exactly how we are. And this is further bolstered by arguments that are being explored in quantum mechanics and cosmology. There are too many unknowns which are factual, that there are things that we do not know once more to come to rock solid conclusions about just the observable universe, much less what happened before the Big Bang or what could potentially exist outside of our reach. Objection 4, the physical universe may not be composed of any discernible group. By this I mean, although all that exists may be referred to as universe or cosmos or whatever term you want to use, there might in fact be other factors which refute this assumption that it is all the same entity, the same big mass of the physical universe. There's no way to know where it stops and starts. So assigning concrete limiting attributes to what exists materially is not possible. And the last assertion is because since we end up talking to Christians so often when it comes to theology, that there doesn't seem to be any way whatsoever to use this particular argument to establish that the Bible is true. And worse, for something to exist necessarily and not be contingent on anything, not be affected by what exists in a contingent way, it would have to be one of the attributes of the biblical God is that he's supposed to be omniscient and omnipotent and changeless, that he doesn't change. And indeed, the Bible says that he doesn't change, and yet in the Bible, he does change. He acts upon himself, which is a change. So, if anything, I would argue that this argument, the Leibnizian cosmological argument, refutes the Bible as the ultimate creator, the biblical God as the ultimate creator. So that's just the 5 objections that I thought of while I was preparing for this hangout, but I'm sure given more time I could come up with more, but I wanted to hear what you guys thought about that.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, that's a really good start. I mean, I think that, well, me and you specifically have gone over my pointed refutation to it, in great detail, and it pretty much springboards off of a couple of your points. But I agree with every one of those things that you hit, and I guess the main problem that I've found with the people that I've spoken with regarding this argument that are believers in this argument, and also doing some research on my own, probably the most well-known advocate of this night right now is R.C. Sproul. He's got, literally on YouTube, he's got a 25-part series where he's trying to teach people how to use this. And it is a Calvinistic approach. He is a Calvinist. And again, I have lots of problems with that end of the spectrum, that as well. But it would seem that it's almost just trying to get you to a point where you have to either establish this is something that we don't know, but we have fairly good indication for, which kind of leads it. I mean, they usually don't go into the Psi 10 approach where, well, you can't know it, so you can't use it. But it's almost, I get that feeling. I get that, well, you don't know this that well, and we don't know this definitively, like what you were pointing out. I believe it was point 1, where we can't know anything outside of the observable universe, which is absolutely true. I mean, other than the little bit of indication that we have through the background radiation the different temperatures in the background radiation, that some astrophysicists believe that could be where we're interacting with another bubble universe, basically bumping into each other. But outside of that, we have nothing that would even indicate that there is, I don't want to say close to us, but there's nothing that would be interacting with our universe as a bubble universe, if that's in fact how it exists. So to say that we know what's outside that is very problematic. But in my opinion, the burden of proof, again, is not on the person bringing up, I guess. I think that the way that this argument's meant to be used is to basically prove in the minds of whoever it's being argued to that, yeah, this has to be the case. Well, I don't think that is. I think that as long as you can establish there is a rational option to this, it completely blows it out of the water. Lee, I don't want to, because I'll ramble. You don't know me well enough. I'll ramble for hours.
No
so
worries.
Jump in, man.
No worries. You sound better than I do. I will always sound like the most layman approach, because I didn't have the foresight to write anything out, and so I may be the one that sounds like they're rambling. But like I said, I think I'm the most rookie out of us three here to hear this argument. But my assessment, at least initially when I heard it, was that it seems to smuggle in like a lot of assumptions. I couldn't figure out where you get the leap from, there is a necessary being, and that being is the God that happens to be the God of whatever religion, that you follow at the time, if you're using this argument. It just, and I see it now in up here on the, from the link, and it just seems to smuggle in a lot of things. This idea of contingency, versus non-contingent, or however you want to word it. It seems that it just.
You just say necessary.
I'm sorry. Say necessary.
You can just say necessary. Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, without going through each and everything, it just seems like it smuggles in a lot of assumptions. It says, this, contingent things are this and this and that, and it seems like it's like molding philosophy to try to make their argument work, and I just find it ultimately unconvincing. I'm not sure if that came across clearly or not.
No, it's absolutely, and I think that's really the core issue. That's a great point. The core issue is that it's often said that where the physical world ends, where it's limited, is where philosophy takes over. But the problem there is philosophy, in this sense, when you're talking about the abstract, the unknown, the best that you're going to be able to do is come up with logical possibilities, come up with potential explanations, come up with things that seem plausible and might even be valid, but there's no way to test to see if they're sound. So all we can really do is use what we know, what we assume, what we believe now to try to figure out if it matches the explanation. And that's really just sort of a very rough methodology that kind of matches a scientific methodology, but it's, when you expand the criteria of what you're considering to be evidence to support a conclusion, a hypothesis, a theory, to say that something is in fact part of reality, when you expand that definition of evidence to be as broad as possible, then there is going to be a point where you have to admit that what you're engaging in is speculation. That's all it really is. It is not a proof of something. And it is possible that this explanation, as Negation was saying, that this explanation is true. It's possible that it's true, that there is something that is a necessary force, aspect of reality, whatever you want to call it, or even a God which is responsible. But to call something like this a proof is severely overstretching. And I think the reason for that is because people who use arguments like this are starting out with an assumption based on their belief about theology to begin with and coming up with the arguments afterward, instead of just starting with the evidence and seeing where it leads.
And that's where I think that the, I guess, apologist feels like they're strong here. Because as soon as pretty much what you've done there, Matthew, is admitted by saying it's possible that, you know, this could happen. And the way that I approach it, I absolutely grant that this is possible, but here is my explanation for another possibility. So I'd like to get you guys to kind of expand, because if anybody wants to know how I deal with it, it's posted on this channel. Don't worry about it. But what I want to know is when the apologist comes to you and goes, "Oh, so you're admitting what I say is true. You're granting my point that there has to be an outside force, whatever you want to call that created us, and in my opinion, implying I win because you're an atheist and you can't grant that there's any kind of force other than natural, which I still would, again, I don't want to get into my argument, but I would still mandate, or still at least hold out the possibility that just because it's transcendental does not mean it has to be supernatural. Therefore, it can still be outside our universe, be timeless, and be the cause, which completely cuts the legs out from underneath that argument, because in the way that some of the apologists are defining this entity to be changeless, my cosmos, my outside transcendental universe works. It doesn't have to change. Whereas, like you pointed out, Matthew, their God has to, by definition, by what's printed in the Bible, change. But I don't want to get down there. Again, when they say that you admit that you're allowing for that possibility and imply that that is a win, what would you say to, someone else out there that's planning on having this discussions? What do you feel is the best way to proceed from that point? Either one of you guys jump in.
Go ahead, Lee.
Oh, okay. Well, I tend to not grant things, at least initially, because I have this sort of viewpoint. I mean, I'm not trying to pull a G-man, but I have this really old video where regarding this. But anyway, I have a short sort of like rule of thumb in that you don't need me to prove your God exists. It's kind of like a mantra that I have. And so I tend to avoid getting myself into situations where they would say to me, oh, okay, so you admit that, and I try to get away from those kind of word salad-y questions, I learned my lesson from watching too many precept videos, you know what I mean? Like, so that way I don't get caught up in those things. And I tend to be a little more, I guess, science-minded, not that I'm a scientist or anything, but I'm not so much concerned with granting possibilities because, anyone could posit anything, and, anyone that's intellectually honest will say, sure, anything is possible, or whatever, however, whatever school of thought they have on that. But, I mean, if I say the great nerf herder in the sky, is a necessary being, you know what I mean? Like, so I care more of, like, what, I'm happy with getting to a point and saying, I don't know. Or you get to a point where it's the universe, and the universe could possibly be eternal, but we know the universe is there, so we have something to work with. You know what I mean? I'm not sure if that made any sense, but the long and short of it is, I'm a little more science-minded.
It does.
I care with what we can actually.
And that's yeah.
Right.
Well, you're making it. I'm sorry to interrupt. You were making an important point that we are going with an honest approach of trying to figure out what's actually true. It's fun and it's interesting to speculate about what's possible, but figuring out what's actually true, I would argue, is pragmatically more important, more effective, more efficient, and just I don't know, almost more, to me, more comforting. What is true, what's not. I would feel less anxious knowing the answer to a question that I don't have an answer to. That is very powerful, to finally figure out something you've always wondered about. And you know, all of the biblical theological reasons why a non-believer wouldn't want to know that they were subject to the sovereignty of God, that is completely secondary, no matter how much it's asserted to be otherwise. We can't even listen to that. It's noise. That I think is where we really have to take into account where this sort of argument is coming from. Let's go back to the actual form of the argument itself here. Let me read it again quickly, and let's try to figure out how exactly Leibniz is getting to the last point, saying that a being, a necessary being, is the conclusion of this argument, rather than some necessary unknown. So first, we have the principle of sufficient reason. Any contingent fact about the world must have an explanation. Now keep in mind that that doesn't mean that that is a discernible explanation, something we could ever figure out. It just means that there is an explanation, not that we should expect to know it.
Right, and I think that probably
it is a contingent fact.
Right. Well, what I was going to say is I think that the easiest way to do this, or the most efficient way, is let's try to do it point by point, understanding that we're either trying to work toward that conclusion, which is exactly what Leibniz did, and at least give validity to the possibility of that God being, if not the most probable, at least rationally justifiable. And so starting with that first point of argument there. Basically, what he's saying is that for everything that exists, must have had a cause, or not everything that exists. Everything that was an effect has to have a cause. So if we just look at that,
it's very similar to the Kalam in that way.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of.
And where I find the problem with that is we are assuming that there is nothing outside of what we've already observed. And all the problems with inference, because that's the only way you can make that as a definitive statement, is infer based on past understanding of our environment and our universe. Now, I'll grant that it's highly, highly likely that at least in our universe, the observable universe, that is the case, that there needs to be something that caused a chain reaction, if you will, that ends up resulting in us today. But to be able to make that statement and have that as almost an axiomatic truth, I don't think you can do that, even in our own universe. There's plenty of... Go ahead.
Let's take a look at the actual wording of it. Any contingent fact about the world, and let's say world just is interchangeable in this sense with universe or cosmos. Any contingent fact about the cosmos or world must have an explanation. Now, must have an explanation, as I said before, doesn't mean we would know what it is. Doesn't mean that we should expect to know what it is. Doesn't mean that any explanation that we come up with is the correct one. It just means that one exists. And the important thing to notice here, as with the Kalam, is that there is an assumption smuggled into the premise. Any contingent fact about the world is already assuming the conclusion that there is a necessary fact about the world before it's even been established.
Well, I think there's an
So
implied.
to
I think there's also
if
an. I think there's also an implied assertion there that any contingent fact that implies that everything we know fits that category. That I mean, because the way that this is
right, which
used
is
most.
that's unsupportable.
Exactly. You
Right.
can't and that's the point I'm trying to make, is that just because you say any contingent fact, which most people, if you don't try to drill down there, are going to group everything under that. They're going to say, well, everything is a contingent fact. I don't know if you can get there. I don't think you can say that definitively, that everything is a contingent fact. I mean, am I off there? I mean,
No.
Well,
Okay.
let's move on.
That's why I was
No,
saying in the
you're
beginning
right.
that
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. That's why I was saying in the beginning I kind of gave a generalized kind of thing, but I said, you know, this argument smuggles in a lot of assumptions, and I think we're going to see that as we go through each one of these.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. I think you're going to
Well,
be.
that's
Yeah.
a few that we've already. That's a few we've already labeled. Just at the briefest attention to that point. There's at least two or three there that we, even as lay people, none of us are professional philosophers or cosmologists or anything, not even close. And it's just that obvious that this just does, even the first premise doesn't hold up as the establishment for the entire argument to be true.
Hey, can you guys give me like 30 seconds to let my dog out? Like, she's a puppy and she's got to go to the bathroom.
Sure.
I'm just gonna like run right real quick.
Okay.
Thanks.
That'll give us time to talk behind your back, man. So.
Yeah.
So now,
Well,
I mean,
I think that the important thing is to pin down when he gets back. Let's pin down what exactly contingent means as it's
right.
being used almost in a question-begging fashion here at the beginning of the argument itself. Now, I'm sure that in his writings he had already established what contingency means before he came up with this argument, but just within the argument itself, since there isn't any explanation of contingency, without having it just sort of be a dichotomy with the necessary, then it sort of begs the question, well, what do you mean by contingent? And that would assume that there is something that is necessary right out of the box, which brings you all the way to the conclusion. And especially when you figure Christianity involves basically just the assertion that the Abrahamic God is changeless, but in actuality is not. So for this argument, this argument basically establishes that the biblical God is a contingent fact of the world, because he does change, and he is affected even by himself, and therefore, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, and if the necessary being is changing, then the universe, which is being argued as contingent, could very well be eternal as well. And that brings us back to the objections I was making about the limitations of our ability to understand the real state of reality.
Right. So, Lee,
Lee, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back. That sounds like I missed a lot.
No, not much. Basically, all we were doing
Not
was
so much.
saying we need to establish what does it mean to be contingent, and I think that, and not necessarily what we feel it is, but what the argument is trying to color contingency as.
I think if I'm understanding the argument correctly from what I discerned, contingent means an effect. So if you know what I mean, like every effect has a cause. You know what I mean? So if you're contingent on something, it means you're an effect of something else. Like I'm an effect of my parents having sex.
That's close.
Am I off
Right,
there?
but it's close, but it's not quite right, because the contingency aspect of it is more a dependency, as in there is a group, if you will, of facts that lean on each other for support. They don't necessarily have to be caused by each other, but they are dependent on, affected by other facts. It doesn't have to be a causal chain. That's how it's, I think, different from the Kalam. It has to do with facts that are reliant upon each other.
Ah, okay. That's different than how I imagined it, or how I heard it. So,
Yeah.
okay. Good deal.
Right.
Well, that's the whole point of this word contingency. It's that it's establishing that you are affected by, or you are relying upon something or anything else in any way, rather than just causally.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool
So
deal.
if I'm understanding this right, and I may be getting a little ahead here, but if there is a causal factor, if there's anything that would cause a reaction or an effect, that let's go with the argument and say that, for argument's sake, we're gonna believe the conclusion, or at least I'm gonna use it for this part of it, in that this supreme ultimate being, whatever it is timeless, unchanging. That would mean that anything in our causal related universe should be unable to affect that infinite being. Do I have that right, you think, Matthew? And
that makes sense. Actually,
that sounds fine.
That sounds good to me, yeah.
Okay, well,
if for anything to be necessary, to be a necessary being or a necessary fact, as opposed to a contingent fact, since the contingency is, you're basically talking about reliance versus self-reliance. You're talking about something which is reliant on other things, or something which is only reliant on itself. But when there are these limitations that are set on something, how it can't just remain the way that it is, it has to change. I mean, the question there would really be, if something changes within itself without being acted upon by anything else, is that just a matter of agency, or is that a matter of not actually being self-reliant or necessary at all? So we really have to define not only just what contingent means, but what necessary means. But that is putting the cart before the horse, because that's the conclusion of the argument.
I got a question too, something kind of to tack on what Ned said. Assume for a second that we grant that the necessary being is the biblical God and all that hootenanny. And in the Bible, at least, God goes through, Yahweh or whatever, goes through a myriad of emotions that are directly derived from what we do, or the people at the time did on Earth. How could contingent beings affect, you know what I mean? Like is that kind of where you're getting at, Ned? Like how do they?
Well, actually, what the scripture that comes to mind.
That's what I was saying before.
Okay.
Right. And the specific scripture that comes to mind with me is Romans 1:18. And basically what it says is for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. So it's specifically that passage alone, if it's inerrant and it's the word of God, that specifically says God is showing wrath. In my opinion, he's pissed off on people like us. I mean, so we hold enough power as atheists to cause his wrath, to piss him off. Now, if that's, and in fact,
there's another. That's a great point. But I'm sorry if I talk over you guys, it's because I have a lag, I have delay. I don't mean to.
No,
so just assume that I don't hear you if you're talking, and I talk over you. I apologize.
It's all right.
No worries. Every time you talk, the big blue face pops up, and it kind of startles me, so I just shut up anyway.
Well,
okay, I just have one other. I think that we can pretty much accept that it's a fact that the biblical God is described to change in the Bible. So even though the Bible asserts that the biblical God is changeless, the fact of the scripture, the passages, if they're to be taken literally, or as genuinely descriptive of this being, it is not changeless. But there's another problem as well, in that the biblical God is at times described as being one with everything. Everything that exists is a part of God. And if that's the case, then God is not a separate entity at all. If God is all things, connected to all things, then God is also connected to contingency. So there is not a separate, there's not a difference between the contingent and the necessary. If that is a facet of God's nature, if the universe is God and we come from God, we are of God, all of these ways that people use to describe Christianity, then there is no difference between contingency and necessary at all.
Okay.
Yeah, that. Go
We
ahead.
beat the
Sorry.
first premise to death.
That's the problem with these arguments, is that as soon as you start to, in my opinion anyway, start to look with a critical eye, what the conclusion is built on is a house of cards. Because once you start pulling at these little threads, the whole thing just unravels. I mean, I think that we've got to the point, and the other thing that's amazing to me on this is even when you get into the hardline apologetics that use this, like in R.C. Sproul. I mean, he even admits that, God's anger is boiling over when Paul's talking about that. And again, I can't remember exactly, but I think that's kind of paraphrased what he was saying in his teaching videos. What I don't get is how you can square that circle in your own mind as an apologist. You have just admitted that God was affected by man's actions, but then at the same time is going to claim that an immortal, eternal anything is changeless, cannot change. Well, if my attitude goes from being pleased to being pissed off, I guarantee you I've changed. Ask my kids, they'll tell you. I mean...
I think when you start to unpack stuff like that, I think you're exactly right. Like you get to show these things, but then you get apologists or theists that come back and say something like, what's the one where they say like God's sovereign will versus his other will, and so you know what I mean? Like it just seems that there's a lot of like ad hoc explanations and and like patch fixes
It's called.
Go ahead.
That's exactly right. When you start with the assumption that God exists first, and then try to figure out his nature without applying the rationality to God, then dog's going nuts over there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My girlfriend came home, so.
It's okay.
It's all right. Don't worry about it, man. My kids are going
when
nuts.
you apply the rationality across the board, then you have a problem, and that's, I think, the real issue. Is if you don't apply rationality across the board, then your argumentation is going to be vulnerable because it's not as important as the assumption you're already making to start with. Anyway.
Yeah. So let's go to point 2 or premise 2.
Premise 2. Wow.
Okay. It is a contingent fact that there are contingent things. Well, I think that we've pretty much established that is, you can't even say that because we don't actually know where contingency starts and stops because it's begging the question again of something being necessary, so contingency has no meaning unless there is something which is necessary. So we don't know where the contingency starts and stops, where the necessary starts and stops, and the only thing which is being asserted by this argument or any Christian theological argument or assumption about the nature of this supposed God is dependent on the Bible, unless you relegate a creator into deistic territory or such abstraction that the attributes defined to the Christian God are no longer relevant, in which case you're not talking about Christianity anymore. So at best, this argument could be valid for a deistic creator if it didn't have so many fallacies in it. But I think that second point, it is a contingent fact that there are contingent things, is just wholly unjustified based on what we already established about premise one.
Can I ask a question? Okay, I'm going to ask a question. So essentially, this argument breaks things down into two categories: contingency and necessary, right? Either you're contingent or you're a necessary being. And I'm under the I guess doesn't that get into sort of like false dichotomy land? Like you're only offering two options, A or B. Like, or is when you say necessary, does that mean the negation of? You know what I mean? Like, are you saying non-contingent is necessary, or you know what I'm saying? I don't know if that makes any sense, but whenever I hear something, an argument that's
the problem, right, if you equate contingency with the effect of, like in the cosmological argument, when you talk about causality and effect, although I've already explained why I think that doesn't really match up for necessary and contingent with cause and effect. It does. They're sort of related to each other, but the problem there is with the limitations, which are extreme on what we know about the physical world. There's no way for us to establish where the contingency or the effect starts and stops.
Right. Yeah.
So if the Bible again if it's to be taken as evidence of a necessary changeless being, then it refutes itself. I mean, there's no real way around the fact that the Bible says God is changeless, and then he changes. Pours his wrath out on people. Well, where did the wrath come from? He was made angry by the contingency. Therefore, he is himself contingent because he's affected by his creation. It eats itself.
Right, and I think that especially the way most of the apologists are trying to use it now is their entire argument's going to rest on trying to assert that anything that follows their first presupposition that they're using in the law of non-contradiction, and specifically saying that something cannot both be contingent and self-emergent, meets that criteria as far as not violating the law of non-contradiction. And if you do assert that there is something that could be contingent and self-existent at the same time, then you're breaking that law. Well, if you take that to fruition, then you have to either say, okay, well, your God is going to break that law. Well, no, because he's timeless. He's eternal. Okay. Well, then let's look and see if there's a naturalistic thing that could be eternal. No, you can't do that because then you have an infinite regress. Well, no, because you can't, and that's what I guess my big problem with premise 2 here is that making that assertion, like you said, Matthew, without foundation, that we know, capital K know, that there are, and again, it's smuggling in the assumption that everything falls under this, that everything is contingent. Everything that we know of has a cause. I don't think you can get there. It's just saying we know there's things that are contingent. Okay, I'll grant you we're coming up
on an hour.
Yeah.
We're coming up on an hour, and I know we wanted to keep this relatively short, so I'm going to speed through 3 and 4 here because it's just 3 is just a summation of establishing the first 2, and right. Since the first 2 fell apart so easily, the fact that there are contingent things must have an explanation. Well, I mean, you're basically saying the same thing as premise 1. It's just, anyway, it doesn't work. I mean, there's no way to isolate what is contingent versus what is necessary, especially when the only entity, as I said, being postulated as necessary isn't, or isn't, at least isn't established as such within the theology. So the fourth point is the fact that there are contingent things can't be explained by other contingent things. Well, just merely asserting that the biblical God is necessary doesn't make him necessary when he's shown to be contingent in the Bible. Unless, written by human beings, they made an error and they described the biblical God in ways that are inaccurate, in which case that calls into question all of the other attributes that they say it has. So the fact that there are contingent things can't be explained by any contingent things. It's again just a nonsensical point. Would you agree with both of that, or both of those?
I think without establishing premise one specifically, and even if you somehow get there, going to premise two, if you can't establish both of those, anything that follows after that is, like I said, it's a house of cards. It completely evaporates. So, in my opinion, being able to, I think, demonstrate why premise 1 and 2 are flawed at least, there's no point in going because we've established 1 and 2 when you haven't, because that's essentially what 3 and 4 are saying. They're saying because we've established 1 and 2, therefore it follows the conclusion that God. Well, you haven't established 1 and 2. So what the hell's the point? So I agree that we don't even need to look at 3 and 4 because they are specifically dependent on, and I know that I thought that was funny because now we're looking at contingency. They are contingent on 1 and 2. So
I was actually going to say something very similar. 1 and 2 pretty much kneecaps the rest of it, 3 and 4 at least. So.
Yeah, I agree. How were y'all think? Did y'all want to? Because I think one thing that at least I haven't done, and I don't, Matthew, you may have because you've had so much. For those of you out there that don't know, Matthew has been doing this quite a while with at least one, if not more, apologists. And I think most of your stuff though has been on Facebook and more of a text type discussion. But I know one thing that I haven't addressed, and
right.
Lee, I don't know if you did and no, you didn't in your conversation. At least I didn't hear it. What I would like to address. Let's say we grant everything, and somehow buy the whole argument, hook, line, and sinker, and now we believe that this universe is created by a God. How can we bridge the gap? Like Matthew was saying, do you guys see any way to specifically get from there to the Judeo-Christian God?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not, and that's why
No way.
Anybody who brings this argument up actively avoids connecting it to Christianity as hard as they can. And the reason for that is because the Bible clearly demonstrates that even though, as I said, the biblical God is claimed to be changeless, he is not changeless. He changes just by manifesting as Jesus and forming the loophole for salvation. That in itself is a change. That's the entire foundation of Christianity. The argument, as I said, eats itself. Okay, let's go ahead and hit this last point because the conclusion is obviously nonsense now. The last point, 5. The fact that there are contingent things must be explained by something whose existence is not contingent. The fact that there are contingent things must be explained by something whose existence is not contingent. That is reliant upon the establishment of there being something which is contingent, which is completely pointless when you can't even establish that there's something which is necessary or the nature of that thing which is necessary, when in fact there could be some facet of the natural world which is necessary. We don't know. Therefore, any explanation for contingency would be not contingent, i.e. necessary, fine. But the nature, the attributes of that necessary factor of reality, whatever it may be, are unknown if they exist. So the entire argument is fallacious from point 1 to point 5 as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, Matt took my answer. No, I'm kidding. What he said. But no, that was I agree wholeheartedly. One of my big problems was exactly getting to point 5 to a God, and then having that God make that leap to being your God. But I think as we've shown, it pretty much falls apart from the get-go anyway, so it's kind of pointless to even discuss the conclusion.
Well, and again, I like playing with these things, and I mean, my technique, as most people have seen, is I kind of work backwards. I grant every premise and see what happens if everything that whatever's being claimed is real. So I guess that what it sounds like, Matthew, and I'm assumingly you're in the same boat, is that because we have a Bible that describes a God as being at least has the ability to change, that it wouldn't meet the definition throughout this argument. Now, if somehow, and again, I know I'm really starting to stretch now, but as some people claim, because it says in the Bible in places that God does not change, would that do you think, if someone could convince you of that through interpretation or however the hell they get there, but anyway, if they could convince you of that, would that allow it to be, I guess, that essential or that necessary being now mandate God, or would there still be other gods out there?
If I understand,
go ahead.
If I understand what you're saying, you're asking if it could be established to me, argued to me, so that I would accept that it was rational that the biblical God is changeless, despite what the Bible says to the contrary, which is ironic because they would have to use the Bible to get to that, or they're using one part of the Bible to refute another part of the Bible. Be that as it may, if I could get to the point where that was established that the biblical God is in fact changeless, no, it still wouldn't in any way establish that he was the necessary being. Not at all. There are always going to be unknowns involved, and there's no way to get around that because we have too many limitations to establish that even if it is a valid argument, that it's a sound argument. There is no way to do it without revelation, which is not demonstrable. So I don't see any way to get there.
Yeah, I mean, either even in the argument itself, where it says premise 5, where it says the fact that there are contingent things must be explained by something whose existence is not contingent, and the conclusion there is a necessary being. Nothing in the premises says being. Like there has to be a being. You're even jumping a big gap by even assuming that it's a being itself, because that assumes intentionality and all that sort of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was.
And the reason for that, yeah, they're doing that because they're starting with the conclusion already. That's the problem. They're starting with the conclusion God exists, God is the necessary being, and then trying to establish an argument to get them there, and they can't get there on the argument's merits alone. Sorry.
Well, and that's exactly what I was trying to point out with those couple of conversations over these past couple of weekends, is that making that bridge, making that leap from using a naturalistic causal factor that is non-sentient, it's just, I mean, it's not going to be this, and I hate using this term because it's wrong, but it's an energy-based, almost like a chemical reaction. Whatever the state is in the cosmos, because of the conditions being right, it allows for the creation of bubble universes, which is multiverse theory, string theory. I mean, it gets into all that, and quantum and whatever. But anyhow, the point that I'm making is that trying to say that it necessarily has to have sentient purpose is one of my big problems with this, because again, it's a bold assertion without any kind of foundation. And one of the main things that it seems, and I know Sproul does this a lot, is that asserts that if there is purpose in the universe, any purpose at all, that mandates that there has to be this ultimate being that bestowed that purpose on the lesser being. And I know it's a little bit different flavor, and I don't know if you guys want to go that way. I was thinking of cutting this off probably in about 20 minutes at the most. I didn't know how long Matthew and Lee you guys had, but most people are not going to go more than about an hour and a half, so I don't want to go down a rabbit hole that you guys don't want to go to. But
I'm
Well,
okay.
I'd like to touch on apologetics. Yeah, go ahead, man.
Oh
I
no,
just
I
want
was
to touch on apologetics after. Apologetics.
okay. I'll make it quick. I'm okay to extend it out a little longer. Although, I don't know how many people are going to sit through an hour and a half of a Leibniz cosmological argument discussion, but it may not be everyone's flavor. But
I know some people.
That's true. But the last thing I want to say, I'll pass it over to Matt, is even on premise 5, where it says explained by something whose existence is not contingent, is not already begging the question by assigning a whose existence instead of saying like something,
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like keeping it more general. It's already sort of shoehorning a deity, kind of getting, you know what I mean?
well, that's the one thing you've really got to be heads up for. And again, I know that I'm using Sproul a lot just because I've been watching a lot of his stuff, but he is a master at starting with a general term, as in something must exist, and then by the end of that 20-minute discussion, that something has progressed gradually and without you even knowing into a specific being. And if you don't watch for it, you're like, wait a second, we started with something and now we have God. And he's defined that in the exact same way, but just by slowly evolving the language to meet what he wants it to get to, they shoehorn that in, just exactly what you were saying. So, but Matthew, you want to get into apologetics?
Well,
I definitely.
I want to address. Yeah, I want to address the apologetics because there are probably a lot of people, if not watching now, but will be in the future, who are wondering why we're 3 atheists sitting here discussing this without having an opposing viewpoint in the room with us. Why someone to play devil's advocate for why the argument could be correct, even though I think that's pretty much a lost cause at this point. No, the reason that we're doing this is because through our own research, through our discussions with hundreds, if not thousands, of theists, we've realized a trend in Christian apologetics which runs diametrically opposed to the reason we have these discussions. We have these discussions, A, because we enjoy them, and B, because we are trying to figure out if they hold water, if they are true, if they accurately reflect reality. And apologetics is designed, even if it's not to shut the mouths of non-believers, it is designed to defend the faith, not to find out what's true. So we are relying upon our own intellectual honesty to look at the argument as it actually is, not how we want it to be, and not try to twist it in any way, except to look at it as honestly as we can and try to find out, does this make sense? Now, there are plenty of, and I think this is entirely uncoincidental, there are plenty of doctrines, passages related to Christian theology who would say that we are not capable of understanding truth, understanding the actual state of reality, because we are basically clouding our senses, clouding our understanding of reality with our unbelief. But that is still, I want everyone who's listening or who will ever listen to this, that is still being told to you by another human being who is biased and fallible, just like you are. And that puts the same limitations on them as there are on you. No one has a leg up when it comes to the application of rationality when there is no other external agency to be demonstrated to be true. It is one person's beliefs, one person's arguments versus another's, and the arguments stand and fall on their own merit. That's all I wanted to say.
I feel like we should start a slow clap, and like I'll stand up slowly. I kind of, it's one of those things with apologetics. For me personally, and I'll always, whenever I talk to a theist, I always kind of give them this sort of intro or disclaimer. I always say I'm a little, biased, I don't know, against logical proofs and apologetics in general, but I really feel like if there was some actual, I know that word evidence gets thrown around and proof and that kind of thing, but if there was actual support for their position, like, hey, look at God, he's in Toledo, he's over there, or something, like, they would be all over that. But because there's none, they have to resort to rehashing these, like, hundreds of year old arguments, and then, when they get demolished, they have a tendency to, like, go back to the drawing board, tweak a couple things, and trot them back out, next season. So I really don't have a lot of confidence when I get approached by someone trying to demonstrate that their God exists via, a logical proof per se. I don't even know if it's even possible to demonstrate a God exists just given that itself, just by logical proof. Kind of skeptical.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And kind of to springboard on both what you guys have said, that I guess I'm going to be a little more pointed, because to me, where I run into this more than anybody is going to be the Calvinist. I've got, just like Matthew, I have some really good friends who are Christians, believers, that are very devoted in what they believe, and they try to give really good, honest answers, and I have no problems discussing things with those guys. I mean, they're great people. Where I have a fundamental problem, and maybe it's because I am an educator and I've taught for as long as I have and all of that, but with the Calvinist, you don't have to go that far. I mean, John Calvin specifically said, and I'm trying to remember basically what he said, well, not basically, specifically what he said is they are not there to answer questions. They are there to close the mouths of the obstreperous, is the nice little fancy word that he used. Basically, anybody that doesn't believe what you believe, your job as a Calvinist is to shut them up as quick as possible. And we see that over and over again. I mean, look at what Cy did in his training video. Anybody that wants to go look that up, in fact, I'll try to link all these videos that I'm referring to in the comments, in the section below, whatever. But he specifically said, we're not, I'm trying to shut people up. Well, why is that? Because he's a Calvinist. He's based on Calvin's teaching. Where does that come from? 1 Peter 3:15. And that's where I don't think most people understand is, 1 Peter 3:15, it's the one that says we're to give answers to those asking questions. But you need to also read past that and what it says in the next line, because it doesn't end there. What it says is the reason that you're giving answers is to shame those people into silence. So in other words, you're embarrassing the people. And again, R.C. Sproul does the exact same thing in the video teaching session that I was referring to earlier. Both sessions 2 and 3, he specifically refers to 1 Peter 3:15 in that light, and John Calvin, what John Calvin was saying about shutting people's mouths. Now, to me, that speaks to the strength, like what you were saying, Lee, of the argument. I know if I believe something and someone comes to me and says you're wrong, I don't go, shut up, nah, 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 and stick my fingers in my ears and pretend it's not going on. I want to know if I'm wrong. So, if anything, I'm going to sit back and say, give me everything you got. I want to know where I'm at. The only reason I can see for trying to keep people silent and not talking is exactly the converse. You're worried about your worldview falling apart if you actually hear what's really going on. And that's, for lack of a better term, got me fired up. I mean, I really do not like people trying to maliciously quell the flow of information back and forth. And maybe I'm overshooting here, and these people really aren't maliciously trying to do that. But when you read Calvin, when you read some of these other people and what they think or how they interpret some of the scripture, it sure feels like it. And when you get into a conversation like I had with Matt Slick, and he won't even address the argument that they contacted me more than a week prior to it and had plenty of time and even quoted what I said in that video, but completely didn't address the argument. It just, to me, it's, you don't need to do anything else. It right there is why they're there. Sorry, go ahead.
Matt, you were going to say something?
Well, I think that when you, first of all, yeah, go ahead.
No, I said, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was, yeah. First of all, I want to say that I think that the majority of Christians are not malicious. The majority of Christians are concerned because they think that we're going to hell.
Right, and
concerned.
that's why
there are some who are doing it out of pride, but I would argue that most Christians that you run into are genuinely concerned that you're going to go to hell.
See, Matthew, I think that's where, and again, when we say most Christians, that's why I preface this with specifically targeting the Calvinists. Because again, knowing Calvinism, using Tulip, if we, again, accept what they're saying is true, there are the elect and the non-elect. And from everything that I have ever got from any Calvinist and anything I've read, you cannot change your fate. There is nothing you can do. If you're an elect and you go out, if Hitler was an elect, Hitler is in heaven right now. And if the best person that has ever walked this planet...
The problem here...
Go ahead.
The problem there is that, according to Calvinists, God could be working through them. So them talking to you wouldn't necessarily be them trying to change your mind, but God using them as an instrument to affect your mind, to change your mind.
But again, Matthew,
to soften your heart.
But it doesn't matter. If, let's say I'm elect, for just argument's sake, I'm elect. If I never change, if I never believe, doesn't change the fact I'm in heaven. As far as a Calvinist believes, now here's the problem. They're going to use the no Scotsman fallacy and say, well, if you're elect, you wouldn't act like that. You wouldn't, I couldn't act the way I'm acting now and be of the elect. Hitler couldn't have been of the elect. Now, again, that's just nothing more than an assertion, because there's nothing to back that up. There's no scripture. There's nothing else that says the elect can't act bad. It's just saying that they won't.
Right.
Now, why, whatever. But again, the problem that I have is that just as some of these, I guess, more established apologists have put it, the reason for apologetics is primarily just to make the people who believe feel better and have something to hang their beliefs on. And the most effective way to do that is not to honestly walk into a discussion and hash out what the facts say. No, it's to embarrass the other person. It's to make the atheist look stupid. It's to use verbiage that people are not used to, that they don't understand. I mean, just whatever. You see what I'm saying? To me, if you look, even though I know William Lane Craig's not a Calvinist, if you look at his debates and you look at the verbiage alone and the citations that he tries to bring to the table, to me it seems that that's what he's trying to do. He's just trying to overwhelm somebody that, wow, look at the big brain on this guy, I can't compete. And again, no one knows who I am.
Well, that's the thing about Christian apologetics. That's the thing about Christian apologetics, about theology in general. The arguments don't get better. They just are better articulated. That's it.
Can I ask a question about Calvinism?
Yeah, go ahead.
Jump in there. I didn't hear about Calvinism until I started watching YouTube videos and stuff, but from what I gathered prior and what you guys kind of just confirmed, there's some sort of like belief in there, interwoven somewhere, where there's elect and there's non-elect, and that's the impression that I got from hearing other conversations, is that if you're elected, you're going to heaven. You got the fast pass to kind of go, no matter what, right? Am I mistaken there?
No, that's it. And it's really not a fast pass versus a slow pass. It is one person has a ticket and one person doesn't, and there's no way to change your fate.
Now, to me, when I hear stuff like that, okay, I think of it from I try to get out of from a psychological standpoint. Follow me here for just a second. It's my understanding that it's human nature, just in general as humans. We're social creatures. We want to belong and this and that, blah blah blah. And when I hear stuff like Calvinism and like I'm an elect, I'm going to heaven, this and that, I sort of feel like it's some sort of have you ever been to like a bar or a nightclub and there's like a VIP line, and the VIP guys get in and they sort of thumb their noses because they think they're badass, and the people that are actually waiting in the big line? That's the kind of attitude that I run across when I run across Calvinists, at least on YouTube. Where it's like, well, you know what I mean? It's almost like an ego push to themselves, thinking that they're special in some way.
Well, they do. I mean, they're the
understand
most.
What you're saying, but I have to. I got to point out that I do have some very good, very considerate friends who are not just Calvinists, but presuppositionalists. So it's just a trend. It's not a defining facet of being a Calvinist.
Okay.
I would argue that underneath all philosophy, underneath all pretenses of trying to understand reality at a higher cognitive level, we are still human beings, part of, as you said, a social species, and that ends up trumping the pretenses of even religion, because at our core, we are trying to get along together just because it's who we are as a species.
And that definitely will open a huge can of worms on that end of it. But one question that you hit on real quick, because we only have about 10 minutes before I was going to shut this down. Have you ever asked the Calvinists that you're saying don't kind of follow this this set that I've put out there? When you ask them why do they preach, why do they do, what do they give you as far as the reason?
Are you talking to me?
I already gave it.
Oh.
No, I'm the one with the Calvinist presuppositionalist friends. I have two. I have more than two, but two good friends, and maybe like on Facebook, I think I have 5 friends that are Calvinist presuppositionalists.
What do they say their reason for being on there and preaching and doing all that for?
It's out of concern. The closest of them, the ones who I'm the closest to, are near tears just thinking about the hell that awaits me as a non-believer. So that's why they do it, because they are so concerned that it overrides any theological doctrines.
Okay, well, does that mean that they're doing it just to show pity, or they're doing it because they think they actually can?
No, I would argue it's out of empathy.
Okay, so they still don't, even though that they're showing empathy and they care, they still don't believe that anything they do is going to make any difference to where you end up, is what I'm saying.
That's right.
Huh, okay.
That's right, because that understanding of Christianity has to do with complete and total submission of your life, of who you are, and everything in reality to God's will. Everything that you think, everything you do has to be run through the filter of this is a gift or a commandment, or I'm on the receiving end in whatever way of God's plan, God's intention, and how they feel about it comes secondary to that. No matter how much it bothers them that they have no control over it, they have to accept, based on their theology, that they are entirely subserviated to God.
Right. All right. We got about 5 minutes, guys. And if y'all want to continue this afterwards, I'm more than happy. But like I said, just so somebody will actually watch this, maybe I want to cut it off at an hour and a half. We can start another one up if you guys want to. We can talk about that off air, or whatever. All right, and even open it to
I have to
anybody.
go.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to go. Otherwise, I would. But I've really enjoyed this. And Lee, it's been really nice to get to know you.
Yeah,
I'm curious though, what inspired you? What inspired you to start getting involved with this stuff?
Oh, I mean, just in general, just on YouTube. Hello?
He muted.
Okay.
Just go hit both sides.
What specifically?
Because
what specifically inspired you?
Well, as far as from a general standpoint, my mom's religious, my family's religious, so I've always been sort of like the antithesis, and it creeped by way of YouTube, and so I've been creeping around YouTube and doing comments for a while, and I've been wanting to get more involved in Hangouts and stuff, and I'm sure, as you guys probably know, that essentially the people that argue the most are the same, like 20 people on both sides, and so Hangouts tend to be the same people over and over and over again. And I kind of approached Ned because I felt that he was a good guy and approachable and would be willing to do this, and so I felt that probably injecting some new blood into the environment may help, and I'm not an overly aggressive person when it comes to, arguing with people, and I think a lot can come from my everyman approach. I am the consummate layman, so maybe that may be less intimidating for somebody. Maybe it'll help somebody relate. I don't know, but kind of what inspired me.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the second.
That's a great answer, but I have to warn you about Negation. He's only nice and approachable until you get to know him.
Yeah. But what I was going to say is you brought up twice that you're young and a layman. Man, keep in mind from my background is science and math, and by the time a mathematician hits 30, 35 at the most, they're done. I mean, as far as a theoretical mathematician, the best work you're going to do is in your early 20s to late 20s at best, and maybe the outlier can stretch it to their mid 30s or so. But and I'm not trying to equate this to theoretical mathematics, but what I'm saying is that injecting that new outside view that hasn't been so clouded and skewed, and like someone like myself, I mean, I've been doing this for 25 plus years off and on. I went to Oral Roberts University. I mean, so I'm old, set in my ways, crotchety, and it's going to be hard to move me. Whereas
I'm pretty old too.
Well,
I'm actually I don't know how old you are, but I'm actually 38. So
see, I've got at least 10 years on you.
Okay. I just when it comes to these sorry, Matt.
The importance of being new to this is in reminding us that we are sort of an echo chamber in these hangouts, the videos, the discussions, the arguments, all of it that's going on online is sort of, in a way, a microcosm compared to how people are actually living their lives and how they're being religious and just going along, not even questioning or thinking in some cases, what they're being told is true because it's what their family believes, it's what their community believes, it's what generations of their ancestors, that's the way it's always been for them. Most believers have simply accepted that that's the way it is. When people start to question, when they start to think, then they might get interested in why this argument is used, why that argument is used, and actually start interacting. But most of the time, the vast majority of believers don't ever get involved in stuff like this. And that has to be kept fresh in our minds, that new blood, as you are, is coming into this with fresh curiosity. But there are still that many more people out there who are completely oblivious to all of this. Before I got involved in YouTube, I'd never heard the Kalam cosmological argument or any of that stuff. I grew up as an atheist, and I've never been a believer. So we have to remind ourselves that we are not the norm. We are an exception because we are looking, we are curious, and that I think is important because we need to keep in mind to be patient and considerate of people who just haven't learned what we have or thought about what we've thought about or seen things from our perspective. Anyway, I think that is just a general methodology question, which is a discussion for another time. Yep. But I'm glad to meet you and welcome to the community.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And I know that, Ned, you're going to close this down in a couple of minutes. I just want to say thanks for responding to me. This has been really fun. I am up for any more, like, if you guys want to choose like a different argument every week or something and kind of pick it apart or do like a weekly, I don't know, whatever. I'm up for anything because my girlfriend does yoga at night, so I have a lot of free time during the evening.
Gotcha.
So
that's a really interesting point. So hey, hang around after we end this, and and we can definitely kind of hash it out a little bit. That's a cool idea.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, with that, again, man, thanks for contacting me and getting this started. And Matthew, thanks for being here. And
I guess. Yeah.
I'll just let anybody that wants to say anything.
I guess we can all agree that the Leibnizian cosmological argument is no good. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Give them the thumbs down.
Exactly. All right. And with that, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see everybody next time.